Hey, it's Mika. I originally planned to post this podfic as a one-shot, but I ran out of time, so I'll be posting this as a two-part series. Part 2 will come out next Tuesday. Also, if you have really good music taste and happen to really like Taylor Swift, maybe check out the covers I've been posting recently. Me and a friend of mine are covering every single song on the original Red album, with uploads every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Anyway, Research and Disaster by Bluey. Chapter 1. Becket Singers isn't necessarily a new intern to Stark Industries' Research and Development Department, but he hasn't been here as long as the singing Roomba has. Becket hasn't worked in a lot of companies. He's only a junior at MIT with a background in chemistry. He finished his honors thesis on organometallic compounds by sophomore year, and wanted something a little bit more challenging for the summer. He's got grad school in the future, of course, because in this day and age, it's very hard to get a decent-paying job in STEM without getting some sort of graduate degree. And while his research already looks fantastic on his resume, there's nothing quite as fantastic as Stark Industries intern, even if only for a summer semester. Where was his point in this? Oh, right. So, Becket hasn't worked at a lot of companies, but even he thinks that the Roomba that follows his boss and plays, what you say, full volume every time Mr. Stark drops something on the ground is more than a little weird. He knows it's the Roomba, and not just a Roomba, by the printed-out stock photo of Mr. Stark's face that is haphazardly taped to the top. He hadn't believed it at first, when the other interns told him. He thought it was some sort of hazing ritual to get the new guy to believe whatever dumb bullshit they make up on the spot. Then he saw it with his own eyes, and he hasn't been the same person since. Becket had asked about it exactly once. His lab supervisor had told him a tale, in a haunting tone, about how the Roomba had just showed up one day, started following Mr. Stark around, and not a single person, in all of the brilliance that is SI staff, could get rid of it. Apparently, once, they'd tried throwing it down the garbage chute, never to be seen again. Only for a new and better Roomba to show up that very next day, as if nothing perilous had happened to it. If the Roomba breaks, it's fixed by the next morning. If someone destroys it, it comes back even more powerful. No one knows who created it and repairs it, and unfortunately, no one knows why. It's not the only thing he wonders about. Becket doesn't know a lot about Tony Stark, but he always wonders why, exactly, a man like Mr. Stark allows a Roomba that plays what you say whenever he drops something to continue following him around a very prestigious building full of business people and researchers from around the world. Becket swears he's even seen Mr. Stark holding open a door for it once. The other interns call Mr. Stark eccentric. Becket is convinced that he, like everyone else, simply can't kill the Roomba, because it's too powerful for even a man like Mr. Stark. Becket won't ever get a chance to ask, though. Perks of being a lowly R&D intern for the Inorganics lab is the fact that he's seen Mr. Stark exactly 5 times in his 2 months of being here, and most of them were during casual 2 a.m. coffee runs in the 3rd floor. A part of him is still convinced that he experienced a mass hallucination, based slowly on the lack of sleep, and several hours spent working on stereometry. Logically, Becket knows the mystery of the singing Roomba is going to remain a mystery. It's not like he has anyone to ask. No one has ever seen the Roomba repair guy and lived to tell the tale. Perhaps that's the reason why he's so surprised when walking into the Inorganics lab, bright and early at exactly 6:45 a.m., only to see a child, crouched in the corner of the room, with several empty drink cans, various screwdrivers, and a Roomba at his feet. To top off his morning, Becket recognizes the stock photo of his boss taped to the top. This is no mere Roomba. The kid, as if sensing him walk in, jerks his head up and meets his eyes. Becket tries to keep his voice even and says slowly, What are you doing with that Roomba? The kid freezes, screwdriver held in suspension looking akin to a deer in headlights. I'm fixing it? The Roomba makes a sad beeping noise. The kid absent-mindedly runs his hand over the sleek black side, as if it were a habit. Why are you fixing it? So it works? It's then that Becket comes to the terrifying realization that could rock the very foundation of the SI intern's social ladder. You're the Roomba man, Becket breathes, and tries to keep the horrified awe out of his voice. Then, seeing as the kid goes up to maybe his chin, he corrects, Roomba-Kid. The kid puffs up like a balloon, and says, like he has a lot of practice, I'm a man. Oh God, Becket says, and tries not to think about the fact that he's solved the biggest mystery in the history of SI within just 2 short months of working here. Sorry about crashing in your lab, but Inorganics had the stuff I needed, sir. The kid scratches the back of his head awkwardly, then gathers his remains, Roomba, screwdrivers, trash and all, before standing up and heading out. He pauses at the door, turns around and says, Thanks for letting me sit here for a sec, and, not screaming for security. Becket never let him do anything, but Becket does not say this. Then the Roomba-Kid is gone, lost in the crowd of people reporting early for work. Becket doesn't try to stop him. Roomba-Kid already holds so much power in his hands, so Becket thinks no one could really blame him for being more than a little terrified in his presence. He just holds his lab keys, stares at the same spot, and tries to convince himself that this isn't all just a weird, coffee-induced dream. As it turns out, Becket isn't the only one to notice something strange this morning. It just isn't until his mandated lunch break that he finds out. Anyone else see the kid who ransacked Inorganics last night? Jess says, and drops her food on the table before slouching in her seat. Jess, like Becket, is one of the 4 interns that works in the Inorganics lab. She's a chemistry major specializing in geochemistry. She's also a senior, a year older than him, who's been interning here every summer since her sophomore year. Becket isn't quite sure how she keeps getting her internship renewed, but he hopes, with careful detection work and friendship bribes, that she will, eventually, tell him her secret. The other 2 people at the table are John, sophomore biochem major, and Ryan, junior, chem major working with redox stability and redox reactions. Together, the 4 of them make up the only interns across the board that are accepted into the undergrad Inorganics lab internship. Someone took stuff from the lab? Ryan asks. A lot of my tools were missing this morning, Jess says. I didn't really think much of it until I saw who did it, and then he wouldn't give them back. Said Mr. Stark needed them, which is bullshit, because Mr. Stark has his own personal lab full of things I've only seen in my wet dreams. I'm gonna go inform the head after lunch. There's a sinking feeling in Becket's stomach, because this morning with Roomba-Kid could not be a coincidence. What did he look like? About yay high, brown hair, brown eyes, looks like trouble. Probably a middle schooler vibe alone. You saw the Roomba-Kid, Becket informs her. The Roomba-Kid? John repeats, slowly. Becket nods. The Roomba repair guy. Alright, back up. Wait a sec. We're talking about the Roomba, right? Like the singing one? The one with Mr. Stark's face taped to the top. At everyone's nods, Ryan continues, There's a Roomba repair guy? Ryan, who do you think keeps replacing the Roomba after we get rid of it? Jess asks. Ryan passes his lips. I thought it was just like Mr. Stark's thing. Like, John says, and is forced to pause. Becket begs every god he knows for Mr. Stark to not be listening to random intern conversations. Like a fetish? I mean, you said it, not me. Jess holds her head in her hands. Oh my god. The Roomba that plays what you say is not Mr. Stark's fetish. Listen, I'm not here to judge kinks. Please shut up, Jess says. Ryan, I am actually begging you to shut your mouth. John, don't encourage him. John shrugs and then snaps to get their attention. Anyway, back to the actual important conversation that we were just having. Roomba Repairman is a kid? He's like 12 years old, Jess confirms, despite the blaring obvious fact that the kid is definitely much older than 12. Maybe a high schooler? I didn't exactly ask. Holy shit. It's whatever, Jess says. As long as the Roomba-Kid stops stealing my stuff and doesn't cause problems, I don't see a reason to worry about him. They should have worried about him, Becket thinks, much, much later. By God, they should have worried. There are 3 things Becket has learnt working under one Tony Stark. The first and most important rule is that unless you hold a lottery ticket in your very hands, you do not, under any circumstances, give Mr. Stark something to hold. Especially if it's papers. Double especially if it's papers that are incredibly important and pertain to the future of the company. Mr. Stark has a way of sniffing those out and avoiding them the most. The second, and very important rule, is that interns are not allowed anywhere near Mr. Stark's personal lab. This is due to the incident in 12. Becket, unfortunately, does not know what happened during this incident, and no one there is currently alive to tell it. The third rule is, if one is to even catch a glimpse of Miss Pepper Potts in any way, shape, or form, they are not to bother her with anything unless she specifically asks them first. Legend says this rule was created by Mr. Stark himself, after a bunch of interns kept harassing her. Becket, personally, thinks that this rule is absolute bullshit, because Miss Potts could end a man's life without a second of hesitation, and doesn't need anything as arbitrary as a rule to protect her. There are, of course, minor rules, like don't use dangerous chemistry equipment alone, always double-check stoichiometry calculations, and don't take stuff from the cabinets without informing a lab head first. As long as he follows these rules, Becket knows everything will work out. It's why rules are made in the first place, to foster peace and create a stable and helpful environment for project development. It's why, again, he finds himself surprised to see Roomba-Kid, arms deep in the chemical cabinet in the inorganics lab. What are you doing? Becket asks, not for the first time. Roomba-Kid doesn't look nearly as surprised this time around. Oh, hi! Your name is Becket, right? Mr. Potts was talking about you and the other interns a while back. Becket is going to ignore the implication that Roomba-Kid is on speaking terms with Miss Potts. He just can't wrap his head around the very idea at this point in his very, very confusing and very short life. That's me, Becket confirms. Then, you didn't answer my question. Oh, right. Mr. Stark locked me out of the lab yesterday for reasons that were not my fault, so I'm gonna cover Mr. Stark's lab entirely with sticky notes, but I want them to be sticky enough that he just can't peel them off, Roomba-Kid says. Dead serious. I'm gonna call them Unstickable sticky notes. Becket thinks about questioning it, but stops. The idea in and of itself is not especially weird. If Roomba-Kid, for whatever reason, has the clearance to be in the lab without Friday tattling on him, then he obviously has permission from someone. Unstickable sticky notes could easily be a cover for a classified project, and, well, Becket's never been one to push. All right, have fun with that, he says. Jess says to bring back her tools because you keep losing them, and she needs those for her project. Jess is one of the interns in this lab, right? Roomba-Kid asks, and shuts the cabinet. He's holding a bucket of chemicals with one hand and a stolen hand crank centrifuge in the other. Tell her I'm sorry. Mr. Stark and I needed it because he snapped his on the Mark 78, and I couldn't find it in the organics lab. He'll get her a new one. Or get himself a new one. I don't really know. Becket eyes the bucket of chemicals and wonders if this is a good idea. Right. Anyways, nice meeting you, Roomba-Kid says, and wanders out of the lab and out of sight. And just like last time, when Becket does go to check, Roomba-Kid is gone, with not a single thing to trace him by. It occurs to him later that he never got Roomba-Kid's name. Then he shrugs, because it's the Roomba-Kid. An eternal mystery of in itself, and, well, Becket is more than happy to be as far away from that mystery as possible. It's not until the next day when he figures out that he's completely and utterly fucked. He's in his lab when it happens, goggles and gloves on, because he's not an animal. Unfortunately, he never gets to finish his project, because his day starts and ends with him accidentally overhearing 2 employees from the engineering sector that were milling about in the inorganics lab for the day. Didn't you hear? Someone put sticky notes all in Mr. Stark's lab, so now he's making us clean them off. Sticky notes? In Mr. Stark's personal lab? Crazy, right? I hear they're hard to get off. Something about the chemical composition allows them to completely adhere to flat surfaces. Everyone's been trying all morning to clean them up. The voices gradually fade to the background. Becket stares at his hands. Oh, Becket thinks. Oh, shit. There are 4 things Becket has learnt, working under one Tony Stark. The 4th rule is that if the Roomba-Kid says he's going to do something, you, under every circumstance, must do everything in your power to stop him. Otherwise, overtime is spent unsticking unstickable sticky notes from a billionaire's personal lab, simultaneously wondering and regretting which life choices led you to this exact, cursed moment in time. It's been exactly 3 weeks since the sticky note incident. Becket has looked hell in the eyes, and hell looks like a rainbow of tiny square papers that stick to just about everything and do not come out without extreme amounts of force and some fire. It's alright though, because after a stunt like that, he knows he won't be seeing Roomba-Kid around again. Mr. Stark would never allow anyone like that to stay, no matter what circumstances came to them being there in the first place. It's not the first time he's been proven wrong by Roomba-Kid. Still, you can only imagine his surprise when he walks into the inorganics only to see Roomba-Kid hard at work once again. No one blames him for turning around and walking right back out. By this point, Roomba-Kid is more than an urban myth. He's a tiny demon running around with the power of God at his fingertips. Becket isn't even sure how this kid is still in the R&D department, and he's not completely sure he even wants to find out. Although it's to the point that Roomba-Kid is around enough that almost everyone has at least glimpsed his face by now. Not many of them have held a conversation, which is evident by the lack of a formal name other than Roomba-Kid, but, well, at least they can prove Roomba-Kid is real, and not just some story cooked up by the chemist employees to scare new interns into behaving. Lunch rolls around, and with it comes the bountiful prospect of gossip from the inorganics interns. I think Roomba-Kid is a kind soul, but my god, he's a misguided little shit that has entirely too much power for his tiny middle schooler hands, Jess says, as she slides into the table seat. He's high school age at least, Becket says. He's a sophomore. Ryan drums his fingers on the table, seemingly lost in his own thoughts. When he notices their confused stares, he rolls his eyes. What? I actually talk to him sometimes. He's weirdly magnetic. He helped me carry stuff to the lab, Jess tells him. Helped John find some of the chemicals from upstairs, and then turn around and stole another centrifuge from the cabinet. He's a sweet kid, but I don't understand him at all. He doesn't have a badge either. I saw him attempting to bribe the security guard to let him through the doors, John said. Becket holds his face in his hands and offers a muffled, "How does he even exist?" Does anyone know? why this kid just exists in Stark Industries and no one knows how to get rid of him, or... He takes after the very singing Roomba he created, Becket says. Jess beckons him closer, like out of some crime TV show, and Becket knows he doesn't get paid enough to deal with this when she says, I once asked Mr. Stark if he knew about Roomba-Kid, and he said, get this, who? Like, I have a theory. Oh God, Ryan says. I have a theory, Jess repeats, more forceful. I think that Roomba-Kid is actually the ghost of a kid who came here on tour and died in this very facility. So now he haunts the halls as a form of revenge. I think your theory sucks and you should be more ashamed of yourself, John says dryly. Jess whacks him on the arm and ignores his laughter. Don't be fucking rude, John. I have to agree with John, Becket says. He ignores the booing. Ghosts can't fix Roombas or stick unstickable sticky notes to Mr. Stark's personal lab. Ryan tries and fails to hide his stinkers when he says, if we give a tip to BuzzFeed's Unsolved crew, do you think they'd come here to investigate? He's not a ghost, John says. Demon, maybe? Oh my God, he's just some random kid. But that doesn't make sense. He fixes the singing Roomba and he takes stuff from the labs and no one can stop him. And he stuck unstickable sticky notes to Mr. Stark's private lab and is still allowed in the building? It's between the bickering that Becket caught sight of a pair of people out of the corner of his eyes. It should have been nothing remarkable about two people in a busy cafeteria, but Becket takes in the familiar sight of curly hair, brown eyes, and a t-shirt with a science pun, talking animatedly along actual Anthony Edward Stark, and promptly drops his lunch. He gapes for a solid second, seeing but not believing. It doesn't look like Mr. Stark is forcing the kid to leave, given the smiles on both their faces. If anything, Becket thinks he looks rather proud. So, Mr. Stark definitely knows Roomba-Kid, Becket says, and discreetly tilts his head in the direction of that level of bullshit. The table goes silent. Oh my God, Jess says. She almost sounds gleeful. Oh my God, he's not just some random kid, he's Mr. Stark's kid! From there, Becket's life only gets weirder. Have you seen Mr. Stark or Peter around here? Actual Miss Pepperpotts asks. Her voice is kind, but there's a hard edge to it. Becket looks into her eyes and only feels absolute respect and a healthy amount of panic because this woman could end his entire life before he could even lift his pinky finger. He's still kind of overwhelmed being in the mere presence of the woman who single-handedly keeps his company running, so all he can do is stutter out, no, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. Well, if you happen to see either of them, do you think you could send them to my office? I have some, issues to discuss with the both of them. Especially Peter. I haven't seen him around in a while. Becket doesn't know who Peter is, but he fears for him. Becket runs into Mr. Stark another 6 times in the span of 2 weeks. Mr. Stark approaches him and has a conversation about his thesis on organic metallic compounds. Becket, miraculously, does not pass out during any of these instances and actually manages to sound like the competent undergraduate researcher that he is. That doesn't stop him from freaking out afterwards, though. Sightings with Roomba-Kid are increasingly common as well. No one has managed to get his real name, but that's not from a lack of trying on their part. Apparently, Roomba-Kid learned of his nickname and has took a liking to it. Becket knows a lot more about him, though. He's 16, a sophomore, goes to Midtown Tech, likes chemistry, likes dorky science puns even more, and, amazingly, is the personal intern of Mr. Stark. Becket hadn't even known that Mr. Stark took personal interns. Seeing Mr. Stark and Roomba-Kid together, though, it hasn't happened since that fateful lunch break where Jess called Roomba-Kid Mr. Stark's son and hasn't let go of it since. He's heard the stories, of course, but Mr. Stark is a busy man and Roomba-Kid does, well, whatever Roomba-Kid does in his free time is not something Becket really wants to know. There's a knock on the door. "Nose goes," Ryan says. Beckett's not one for door duty, so he's the second person to put a finger on his nose. Jess is, like always, last. She grumbles and grabs the paper she's working on, but stands up from where she'd been lounging at her desk with Grace, and walks over to the entrance anyway. Jess opens the door, then promptly almost drops the papers she's holding. "Mr. Stark! And, can I help you, sir?" Beckett's head snaps up so fast he swears he gets whiplash. There's a wheezing sound from John, and Ryan coughs something that sounds suspiciously like a laugh into the back of his hand. There, standing in the entrance door to Inorganics, is actual Anthony Edward Stark and Roomba-Kid. Mr. Stark is smiling, hand on Roomba-Kid's shoulders, but Roomba-Kid absolutely does not look like he wants to be there at all, which is a stark contrast from all the times Becket and co. have caught him sneaking in and stealing equipment and chemicals. The first thing out of Roomba-Kid's mouth is, "Don't do it." "Ignore him," Mr. Stark says, with all the exasperation one gathers from fathering a 16-year-old. "This is the Inorganics lab, right? Kid, introduce yourself." Said kid had very obviously been attempting to sneak off when Mr. Stark grabs his arm and yanks him back into the room. Becket has no shame in admitting that he's gaping. The entire lab is eerily silent. Even the actual employees watch with rapt attention. Roomba-Kid bites his lip and crosses his arms. For a moment, Becket wonders if he'll answer at all. Then Roomba-Kid says, "Hi, I'm Peter Parker." "Oh, wow," John says, like Mr. Stark hadn't exposed Roomba-Kid's secret identity to the entire Inorganics department. Becket thinks of that one conversation with Mr. Pepper Potts not even a week ago and tries to hide his cringe. If Roomba-Kid survived Miss Potts' fury, he doubts there's much else on the planet that can get rid of him at this point. Although Becket finds that his stomach twists unpleasantly at the thought of Roomba-Kid leaving. It's as Ryan said, he's weirdly magnetic. "Babysitting," Mr. Stark says. "I need to go do important superhero things, and he likes you guys for some reason." "Don't do it!" Roomba-Kid, Peter, repeats. Then he whirls around on his heels with a surprising amount of grace and says to Mr. Stark, "Let me come!" "Absolutely not," Mr. Stark tells Peter. He faces the horribly confused quadruplet of interns, as if he isn't essentially asking them to be an overqualified babysitter to his son. "Peter is very slippery and very persuasive, but I need you guys to keep him in this room until I come and get him." Jess still hasn't taken her hand off the door handle. Ryan has his head in his hands, looking every bit as overwhelmed as Becket feels, and says, "What is even going on here?" "Let me come, Mr. Stark!" "No, you're gonna stay here because I'm your boss and I said so." "Fire me then," Peter says, like a challenge. Becket almost yells because he worked so hard to get here, and this kid is just goading to get fired. "Fire me right now!" "No," Mr. Stark says. "Suffer." Peter chooses to stick his tongue out like a mature adult. "Do not move. Do not come after me. I'm serious, Peter." "Hi, serious. I'm Dad." "I'm ignoring that," Mr. Stark says. He turns back to the interns and gives them all a hard look. Beckett's sweating underneath his required white lab coat. "Keep him here." Jess says. "Yes, sir?" Mr. Stark nods once and sends a look at Peter, who rolls his eyes. He's gone and out the door before another word can be uttered, or before Peter can manage to attempt to goad his way into being taken on a superhero business trip, despite being a 16-year-old high school student. Personal intern my ass, Becket thinks. Beckett's not quite sure what to make of Peter Parker, but Peter Parker has no qualms about making everyone out as friends within the next 10 minutes of being trapped and imprisoned in an SI lab. He's also very forthcoming with information. In a grand total of 5 minutes, Becket has learnt that Mr. Stark is not, in fact, his dad, that he lives with his aunt, that his best friend's name is Ned, that he's slowly befriending a girl named MJ, and he keeps the Roomba running because he thinks of it as a joke and a challenge. Apparently, the entire disaster started because Mr. Stark thought he couldn't program a Roomba to follow him around, considering how much he's in and out of SI halls. Peter was the one who went the extra mile and added music whenever Mr. Stark dropped something. Now, Mr. Stark is cursed to have a musical Roomba follow him around the halls of SI for all eternity. Huh. Take that, Mr. Stark. Never underestimate what teenagers will do out of spite. As it turns out, keeping Peter from leaving is, in fact, a very hard and very demanding job. Peter tries to sneak out no less than 15 different times in the first 20 minutes of the lab, and the only reason Becket even realizes he's left is due to the warning alarm Mr. Stark had personally installed to keep him there. "Oh my god, are you actually Batman?" John asks, and holds Peter under the armpits like a cat to keep him from escaping the upteenth time. Peter's feet dangle a couple inches off the ground, and he laughs, like the joke is somehow ridiculously funny. "Something like that," Peter says, then kicks his legs. "Put me down." "Bad kid." Ryan drops him anyways. "I need a squirt bottle or something, man. I don't want to get fired because you escaped the lab." "Mr. Stark won't fire you," Peter says, then kicks his legs. "He's nice." "To you, maybe," Jess says. "You get father-son privileges." Peter's face turns the color of a cherry tomato, but he says, like he has a lot of experience, "I already told you. Mr. Stark isn't my dad." "Uh-huh." "I'm serious. I've only known him, 2 years. That makes it even more suspicious. Where did he even find you? I thought—" Becket takes this time to interrupt, ending an argument before it actually happens. He's been meaning to ask anyways, ever since that conversation with Miss Potts from a week ago. "So, Peter, did you get in trouble with Miss Potts?" Peter looks at him like he's grown another head. "Why would I get in trouble with Miss Potts?" "Because last time I saw her, she said she was looking for you, and she, did not look happy." "Oh, don't worry about that. Miss Potts loves me." Peter grins at him. "She was mad at Mr. Stark because Mr. Stark took me out of school last week for, unplanned internship purposes." They chat and laugh and goof off for the next couple of hours. Peter's thwarted escape attempts gradually die off as he becomes more and more comfortable around the group, and he's around and helping with as many chemical equations as he can split his attention between. In the end, Mr. Stark comes and picks up his wayward intern long after the sun has set, with a thank you and a promise of extra overtime in their next paychecks. Peter leaves without ever stealing a centrifuge or any assortment of chemicals, so Becket counts that as a victory. After all, it's not every day you learn so much stuff about the elusive Roomba-Kid and his iron dad. Peter Parker breaks Becket's list of SI rules and creates new ones just as fast. The most important rule comes right after he spots the two of them in the hall. Peter carries a stack of papers that he seems to be trying, unsuccessfully, to give to Mr. Stark. It's a losing battle. The first rule, and previously, not that Becket knows it at the time, most important rule, is that Mr. Stark will not be handed anything, especially if anything consists of papers that are important to the future of SI Industries. Becket can see the bold Stark Industries letterhead from here. "Take them," Peter says. He follows Mr. Stark around on his heels, poking him every so often with the corner of his packet. Mr. Stark is steadfast in his resolve to ignore his wayward intern. "Go put them in my lab," Mr. Stark says. "You won't read them if I do that," Peter says. Mr. Stark pauses, then shrugs as if the accusation isn't completely baseless. "I'm gonna tell Miss Potts if you don't take these." "Good luck, kid. She's got years' experience trying and failing to hand me things." Peter sighs, exasperated, but there's a smile on his face. The papers are still clutched tightly in his hands. "Mr. Stark, hold them." "No." "Hold them." No, kid. I'm gonna drop 'em. Peter! Peter drops them. The papers start to fall like in slow motion. Becket can only watch as they get closer and closer to the floor. They're not even stapled, Becket thinks in a growing sort of terror. Mr. Stark catches them. Kid, you are actually going to kill me. You see these grey hairs? That's because of you, Peter. You are giving me grey hairs. Peter laughs and gives him a smile that could outshine the sun. Thanks, Mr. Stark. There are 5 rules Becket has learned since starting his internship. Number 5 is that Peter Parker, alias Roomba-Kid, is an unstoppable force of nature that no one can squash, and fears no god nor man on this earth.